So we're going to be talking about angiosperms. And angiosperms are the plants that are the most economically, ecologically important plants on Earth. Now, they were kind of late to the party, geologically speaking. They didn't appear until kind of about 2/3 of the way through the era of dinosaurs. But once they did appear, they really changed. They changed the whole planet, really. They changed how animals were evolving. There were now things like pollinators, bees. There were lots of new lifestyles that were available that weren't when basically you just had things like gymnosperms and tree ferns and all those other things that they don't produce flowers. They don't really need pollinators. They're mostly wind pollinated. Now, there are two groups within the angiosperms that we've kind of talked about before, but I want you to remember. You have the monocots and eudicots. And I will be asking about these the whole semester, so you want to make sure that you know the difference between them. So the flower parts. So we're going to be talking about flowers today because, of course, that is the essential part of an angiosperm is a flowering plant. So in monocots, we've got flower parts in 3s. Now, of course, it says usually because there's always exception. Eudicots, 4s and 5s. So the pollen, basically you have 1 aperture, you have 3 apertures over here. You're probably not going to be using this too much. The cotyledons, when we talk about seeds, basically these are the seed leaves. They have 1 seed leaf, they have 2 seed leaves. That's actually where the name comes from. Monocot is monocotyledon. Eudicot, 2 cotyledon. This is usually parallel, so meaning all the veins are going the same direction. You may remember this when we did our C4 lab. We did our C4 eudicot and our C4 monocot. And basically that was one of the things I was telling you about, the difference between the monocot versus the eudicots, the parallel versus the net venation. When we get into stems, you'll see the vascular bundles are scattered, but here they're in a ring. Secondary growth, they don't really have, there's not too much of this in monocots, but it's very, very common in eudicots. And we'll talk about that later. So monocots are monophyletic. Dicots, we can use air quotes. There's some early divergent groups that are sometimes considered part of this, so we're really going to talk about eudicots. So this is images of what I just told you. So flower parts in 3s. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But not just petals. You can also look at stamens and other things. So leaf venation, stems, the pollen, the cotyledons. So almost all flowering plants are either eudicots or monocots. There's a few in that kind of basal angiosperm group that's not a clade, and some of those are important, and some of them are pretty useful and well liked by humans, but the vast majority are basically one of these two. So here's a phylogeny. You do not have to memorize this, but just to understand what I'm talking about. So these are the eudicots. Those of you that had plant taxonomy, this may look a little bit familiar. So these are the eudicots over here. Here are the monocots. They're their own clade. And then we've got these, quote, basal angiosperms over here and the magnoliids. And it includes some really, quote unquote, primitive plants, which we'll look at. And we'll look at some of the patterns of evolutionary change that we see basically from these kind of original flowering plants to what we see today. So the angiosperms in general are a monophyletic group. They're the largest group of living plants. 300,000 to 450,000 species. To put that in perspective, there's only about somewhere around 3,000 species of mammals. So there's way more species of plants. There's about 10-ish thousand species of birds. So in terms of the number of species, the only other thing that really has more are things like insects, and I think fungi have more species. So huge amounts of species, and a lot of this is driven by flowers and fruit. So very little variations in flowers and fruit. And of course, one of the other reasons is plants don't move around as well as a lot of animals, so they kind of stay in one place, and that means they're going to diverge from each other very frequently. Just here in Missouri, we have something like several hundred species of oaks. So there's a huge amount of species. And those of you that took plant taxonomy may go, yes, there's way too many species. Which is why plant taxonomy, we don't learn species, we learn families instead. So we're learning families in plant taxonomy. Now, y'all will not have to memorize any families, so you can say, woohoo! But you will be learning some of the terminology that will allow you to use keys to identify families. So as we get later on in the semester, one of the things I will do is I'll have a key for you, and you'll have to use it to key out some specific plants to a family, to a plant family. And we will talk about a few of the major plant families. So not only do angiosperms produce flowers, they also produce fruits. These are the only plants that produce a true fruit. So what a fruit is it's this thing called an ovary, which is essentially a leaf that's folded over on itself and that encloses the seeds on the inside. Now, what that leaf turns into, we can have culinary definition of fruit versus botanical fruit. Botanical fruit means that basically anything that is going to come from an ovary that comes from a flower, that's a fruit. And that could be anything from a peanut to a grapefruit to something like, a milkweed pod that makes fluffy stuff. So here we've got, this is the smallest flowering plant. And of course, anybody know what this thing is? This is a honeybee. So we've got a honeybee here. Now this honeybee is probably not actually pollinating these because it's really too small. This is the smallest flowering plant in the world. This is called duckweed, so Lemna minor. So if you get a really close up, this is actually what's left of the flower. It doesn't have pretty petals, but it does have, this is the, let's see, let me get in here. Here's the female part right here. These are the two male stamens, and this is the whole plant. So teeny tiny, world's smallest flowering plant. We have parasitic flowering plants. This one is called dodder, and basically it doesn't have any chlorophyll because it steals what it needs from other plants. It basically essentially roots into other plants and sucks out all their good stuff. So the world's largest single flower, this is Rafflesia. It's another parasitic plant. So it's a really crazy looking flower. So we have another parasitic plant. This one is called Indian pipe. This one's pretty common in Missouri. I've seen it in quite a few places. If you go into conservation areas, you're walking around trails, especially in the fall. These most frequently come up in the fall. It's very common to see these. Now, when they dry out, people like to pick them. They dry out, they turn black. So, and you can't transplant these because they are mycoheterotrophs. They're actually parasitic, not even on other plants, but mostly on fungi that are growing on other plants. So they're impossible to transplant and keep alive. You just kill them. So just take pictures. Okay, so let's talk about the floral structure. Guaranteed, 100%, you will see an exam question that looks like this. Now, it may not look exactly like this. You want to know the flower structure. Guaranteed, 100%, it's going to happen. Believe me. Why? Because, for two reasons. One, if you're going to identify plants, flower structure is basically the number one thing that you need to be able to recognize. So if you want to know what a plant is, if you want to know what it's related to, you look at its flowers. You don't necessarily look at its leaves. Now, if you've gotten it down to a family or a genus, then you may look at the leaves to identify the species. But to know kind of generally what kind of plant you're looking at, you have to look at the flowers. And if you're going to use a key to key out anything, you need to know what these terms are. Otherwise, you're going to be lost. You have no idea what you're talking about. Also, I like to talk about botany as kind of the post-apocalyptic survival skill. If you, for example, need to cross-pollinate your plants, you're wanting to breed a new variety, or you're just wanting your plants to produce fruit, sometimes you actually have to hand-pollinate your plants. And if you don't know what these parts are, like, how do I pollinate the plants? I don't know. I look at the flower and I hit it a few times. It's like, no, that's probably not going to work. Okay, so let's go over our terms. So we've got the calyx. This is a collective term for sepals. So sepals are the green things that usually cover the flower. They're usually protective. They're usually green, although not always. There's lots of variation in these. But when you talk about all of the sepals together, that's the calyx. Then we've got the petals on the inside. So we're going from the outside to the inside. So we've got the petals, which are usually brightly colored, although not always. Some plants don't actually have petals at all. So that collectively, all of the petals, that's what we call the corolla. So all of the petals is the corolla. Then on the inside, all of these together, the calyx and the corolla together, we call the perianth. So think of this perianth. So these are the anthers right here. So those are the male parts. So the peri goes around. It's like perimeter. Perianth, the peri goes around the anthers. So all of this is the perianth. It's often used in plant identification because in some plants it's hard to tell the difference between the petals and the sepals. So they'll just talk about the perianth. So the perianth is sterile. This is the non-reproductive part of the flower. You can rip it off and the flower will still function effectively in most cases. There's a few examples where these can get fused to some of the reproductive parts. But the perianth is basically just for, essentially for advertising the presence of the flower, for getting pollinators to show up. Okay, so we've got whorls. So you've got your sepals, you've got your petals. Now we've got two more whorls. So basically a circular area around the flower. So the next two whorls are fertile. So the next whorl is the male part. So we have the stamen. So you can think of stamen. Get it? Stamen. This is the male part. So you got the anther. Anther or anth or andro usually means male, sometimes human, but in this case it's male. It's got a filament, the stalk that the stamen is sitting on, that the anther is sitting on. These are the ones that will break open and release pollen grains. So to pollinate a flower, you've got to get pollen grains, and it's got to land on the female part, specifically the stigma. So the stigma is up here. This thing is basically a big modified leaf. So you've got the stigma, that's basically the sticky part here. You've got the style down here and the ovary down here. The ovary is the thing that covers the ovules, and the ovules are the things that will become seeds on the inside. This structure down here, the ovary, this is the thing that actually turns into a fruit. Together, this whole thing is called a pistil. It's sometimes called a carpel, depending on whether it is single by itself. So this is the diagram. Here's a real flower. This is a lily flower. Now can we say, is this a monocot or a eudicot? So we can kind of look for the petals. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 3 petals, 3 sepals. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens. So it's probably, is it going to be a monocot or a eudicot? Anybody got a guess? No? So monocots or eudicots. So if we've got 3 petals and 3 sepals and we got 6 stamens, it's going to be a monocot, right? So this will be a monocot. So monocot, it's got its flower parts in 3s and multiples of 3s. So stamens, you've got the actual anther right here, and then you've got the filament. And if you look on this image, you can see it looks kind of dusty because these have broken open and they've released their pollen. So stamens, you've got an anther and a filament. If you're talking about all of the stamens together, it's called the Androecium. If you're talking about all of the female parts, it's the Gynoecium. There, somebody got it. Yay! Yes, so that is a monocot. Very good. I missed them. Sorry about that. We'll try another one in a second. So here we've got the same thing. So we've got our petals. Basically, we removed 1 petal. We've got the ovary, the style, and the stigma. So how this is going to work, and I'll just give you a general overview, is pollen has to land on the stigma. It will germinate. The tube nucleus grows down through here, and it will actually unite with an egg that's inside of an ovule that's inside of the ovary. And this ovary will develop into some kind of a fruit. Now, when I say fruit, I mean botanical fruit. It may not be fleshy and tasty. It may be hard and full of really hard seeds. Okay, so as I said, so the carpel or the pistil, really what this is, it's essentially a folded up leaf. So what you've got is a leaf here, and basically you've got ovules along the edge. So this thing, even as it develops, it actually folds up, it fuses and you get something like this. And if you look at this, you might say to yourself, gee, that looks kind of like maybe a green bean pod or a pea pod. Those are actually the simplest types of carpel. So this is the megasporophylls. So if you remember, we kind of mentioned sporophylls before, but instead of actually producing spores, these ovules actually contain on the inside the female gametophyte. The whole female gametophyte is actually in there. So they do have the spore, but the spore doesn't leave the parent plant. It doesn't leave the sporophyte. It stays right there. It doesn't really make a spore coating, and it basically germinates inside of this whole thing. So they fold over, they enclose the ovule, and then this leafy part that's actually the same as the parent plant, that is what's going to develop and form into a fruit. So a carpel or a pistil, you're going to have an ovary. So you got an ovary down here, you got a style, and you got a stigma. And the stigma is probably one of the most important things to remember, because this is the part that actually accepts pollen. So if you're going to pollinate a flower, that's where the pollen has to get to. It has to get to the stigma. And it's usually sticky. It's providing some food for the pollen grain to germinate. So this is the part that gets a little bit confusing. And when we get into our fruit lab, which may be a little bit interesting, because usually we like to eat fruit in the fruit lab, and eating and COVID is not really a good combination, but we'll see what we can do. So basically you get one of these that's folded over. So what you can have is you can have a flower that instead of just one of these folded over leaves, you have a bunch of them. This is what we call apocarpous. So anytime you see apo, that means apart or not stuck together. So apocarpous means that you've got a pistil here, you got a carpel here, you got a carpel here, you got a carpel here. An apocarpous gynoecium. Classic example of that is a blackberry. So if you've ever eaten a blackberry or a raspberry, you may notice that it was made up of those tiny little round things all stuck together. Each of those is actually a separate carpel, a separate folded over leaf with a single seed inside. And that's an apocarpous gynoecium, so they're not stuck together. However, you can get these that stick together and they fuse, and that's called syn. Anytime you see syn or sim that's fusing, syncarpy, these are going to stick together. Now, if you've ever cut open, for example, a pepper, a green pepper, and you notice that it's got these pieces, or if you cut open, say, a lemon or an orange, and it's got those little sections, each of those little sections is a carpel, and it's an individual leaf, that modified leaf that has folded over, and then it's going to have seeds on the inside. So if you've ever taken a lemon wedge, if you cut it just perfectly, it'll actually be a single carpel on its own. So that's the difference between apocarpy versus syncarpy. Syncarpy is probably the most common in most plants. You'll see lots of this fusion, and you can have many, many carpels. So for example, in like an orange or something like a grapefruit, it's got lots and lots of carpels all stuck together. But you can get as few as 2 or 3, or you can get 10 if you had to. So where are the ovules actually attached? So this is what we call placentation. This is another one of these terms that basically you use to identify plants. So there's 3 major types. There's kind of subtypes of these, but we're going to keep it relatively simple. So one of them is called parietal. So parietal means it's basically stuck along the outside. So if you've ever opened up a pumpkin and you've noticed that a lot of the seeds are usually on the sides of the pumpkin wall. So if you carved a pumpkin, that has parietal placentation. So parietal placentation, they're along the edge. Versus if you've cut open a tomato, you've probably seen there's kind of these cross walls, and then there's this center part that has all these seeds in the middle. That's what we call axile placentation. So it's in this axis between these carpels that have been fused together. Then the last one, which is a little bit uncommon, I tried to think of a good example of free central placentation. There's something that we eat that has free central placentation, but I can't think of it right now. It'll come to me later. But free central placentation, basically these are all fused together, and basically the cross walls have been lost. So instead, all the seeds are basically on a post in the center. So all of these come from a syncarpous pistil. So this pistil is actually composed of multiple carpels. So you can see here, we've got 1, 2, 3. So this one's actually composed of 3 carpels. Now you might think, hey, it's got 3 carpels, that means it's a monocot. That can be true, but that's not always true. You have to look at the rest of the flower to make sure that the whole thing basically has a pattern of 3s. So that's a syncarpous gynoecium, is when these petals are basically, these carpels are fused to one another. Can apple have free central? Apple is basically a axile placentation. So if you cut one open, there will usually be cross walls. And if you look very carefully, there will be 5 chambers in the center, because apple is a eudicot. So when you do a perfect cross section, you'll actually see it. We'll actually get to look at this in the laboratory, because during our fruit lab, you actually get to cut open all of the fruits and look at them and basically count how many carpels they have. It's much easier to look at a developed fruit. You can do this with a small fruit. In fact, I actually have a video, which I'll share with you guys a little bit later on my YouTube channel, which I made cutting some of these ovaries open before they develop, and you can actually see the placentation on each one. And it's a very important principle in botany. This is one of the main things that most botanists use to identify different types of plants. Okay, so a couple of other terms that we're going to look at before we go on. So most of the plants, when you get flowers, they're not going to be just a single flower. Now you can have something called a solitary flower. Of course, if you got roses for Valentine's or for some other time, or you grew roses, or especially in the springtime if you get like a tulip, they're almost always solitary. And really, solitary is very unusual in most plants, because if you think about it, if you're a plant, you produce one flower. If something happens to that flower, there went your whole reproductive effort. So people, for whatever reason, they think solitary flowers are beautiful, so they tend to breed plants to produce solitary flowers. But most of them are in groups called inflorescences. So there's lots of different terms for these, and I won't make you memorize all of them, but there's a few of them that you'll want to remember. Raceme's kind of the most generic and the most common. Basically, it's just on little stalks. A spike is kind of like a raceme, except it has no stalks at all. A corymb is basically like a raceme that's pretty much flat-topped. An umbel is kind of like a corymb, but except that all of the stalks are the same length. You can kind of think of this as an umbrella that's been blown out the wrong way. The most important one that you'll want to remember is a capitulum, or a head inflorescence. This is very specific to a particular family of plants called the aster family, or the sunflower family. They're actually not made of one. They look like they're one giant flower, but they're actually made of lots and lots of tiny flowers. So panicles are basically a little bit more complex versions of racemes. And then you've got a cyme, which basically can kind of come in a number of different forms, but the one that goes kind of in one direction can be a helicoid or a scorpioid cyme. And those of you that had plant taxonomy, you may remember that's one of the characteristics of the Boraginaceae. So they're defined by the placement of the peduncle. So the peduncle is basically the stalk that goes between the flower and basically what is this rachis down here. So those are inflorescences, and those you can use to identify plants. So umbels, especially compound umbels, where you have basically one set of stalks here and then you have another one on top, that's characteristic of the carrot family. So you can identify and look at a plant and say, okay, that has this kind of inflorescence. It's probably a member of, such and such a family. So here's some other images. So you've got panicle, you've got the umbel. Here's the compound umbel I was talking about, characteristic of the carrot family. But don't go randomly eating things from this family. Some of them will kill you, so you need to be able to identify more than just a family in their case. So here's a spike. This is a catkin. Usually these are produced by trees. Usually they're all male, and they just release pollen. If you have seasonal allergies and you see these hanging around, usually that's bad. But probably in a few weeks, we're going to start getting these falling out of trees, because many trees actually produce their flowers really, really early. Now notice, this doesn't have any petals. This doesn't have any petals either. Many plants produce flowers that do not have beautiful petals. So just because you don't see pretty flowers on something doesn't mean it's not a flowering plant. So here's an example of a raceme over here. Okay, so this is what I was starting to tell you. So some variation in flower structure. So perfect flowers means that the flowers are bisexual. They have both male and female parts. That is kind of the normal state for most plants. It's not certainly the state for all of them. Some of them are imperfect, so the flowers can be unisexual. So here we've got an oak tree. So these are these catkins right here. So these are the male flowers, and over here, these are basically the products from the female flowers that you may recognize as acorns. So these are imperfect. They're either going to be staminate, male, or carpellate / pistillate. Same thing. So plants that produce both staminate and carpellate flowers on the same plant, they're what we call monoecious or monoecious. Monoecious means that plant has one gender. They produce both male and female flowers. They're all the same. They're monoecious. So mono, of course, meaning one. They have one type. However, and I've mentioned this before, some plants produce staminate and carpellate flowers, and this is also true of things like gymnosperms. They produce staminate and carpellate, staminate cones and basically ovulate cones on different plants in some cases. Those are what we call dioecious. So basically one house versus two house. So dioecious means, di means tooth. So that means there's two different versions of the plant. So there's male and female plants. So most plants are both male and female at the same time. So you can't say, okay, that's a male oak or a female oak. It's both. But some plants are either male or female. So in the case of hops, so those of you that are old enough to drink beer, this is one of the flavorings that people put into beer. And hops come in male and female plants. But it turns out only the female plants are the ones that actually produce useful substances. This is also true of marijuana. It's only the female marijuana that actually produces stuff that people are interested in. Any fruit trees that are male and female, the females are the only ones that will produce fruit. The males will just produce pollen. So that's an important thing to remember. Okay. So ovary position. So this is another one of these terms, and I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you all at once, but basically all of these are important for plant identification. They help you understand how plants work. So ovary position is very important in identifying angiosperms. Those of you that go on to plant taxonomy, this will be essential for you to know because it allows you to distinguish between certain families. So a superior ovary basically means that the ovary is on top and everything is attached below it. So this is a superior ovary. An inferior ovary, the flower parts are attached at the top. Now, what may be a little bit confusing down here is we have two other terms. So there's other descriptive terms we can describe the flower. So a hypogynous flower means that the flower parts are attached below the ovary. So this is still a superior. The ovary is superior, but the flower, the rest of it, is hypogynous. So hypo meaning below. Now this one in the middle is a little bit confusing, and we'll hopefully get to look at some of these, which reminds me I need to go force some branches for y'all for next week. Week after next. So the perigynous flower, peri again means around. So this thing actually makes a cup going around the ovary. Technically, the ovary is still superior because everything is attached below it. But the flower can be described as perigynous. So the flower goes around the gynoecium. So the epigynous flower is always going to have an inferior ovary. So inferior versus superior ovary. So odds are, the next lab exam, when we get to that point, I'll show you images of these and I'll say, hey, is it an inferior or a superior ovary? So you want to make sure that you know those in addition to your flower parts. Guaranteed going to ask you flower parts question. You will have that for sure. So here we've got, this is an apple blossom. So let's take a look at this. So based on what we've just learned, looking at this particular blossom, is it a monocot or a eudicot? What do y'all think? Monocot or eudicot? Anyone got a thought? Monocot or eudicot? I think I didn't tell you what it was. Kind of gave you a hint. Eudicot. So we got eudicot as a response. Is that a good response? Let's look. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Got a lot of stamens here. If we look carefully, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals. So we say, okay, we got 5 petals, we got 5 sepals. And if we look in the background, we can kind of see that the leaves have net venation. So we say, yes, this is a eudicot. This isn't just any eudicot. This is an apple blossom. And if we were to really get tricky, we could say, well, what's the ovary position? So if we look very carefully back here, you see this bump in the back. That bump, that's an inferior ovary. So you can see, if you look very closely, you kind of see that there's no green thing sitting right here. It seems to go back here. So this is an inferior ovary. And this plant, it's an apple blossom. That inferior ovary right there, that's what turns into an apple. So if you've eaten an apple recently and you notice that one end has got this kind of star shape on it, that's what's left of the sepals at the end of the apple. In fact, sometimes if you look on the inside, you'll actually see what's left of the stamens on the inside of the apple. And then one end of the apple is the stalk, and that's basically the peduncle that attached the flower to the plant. That, my friends, is where apples come from. It's sort of like, where do babies come from? I don't know. Where do apples come from? I don't know. The tree just makes these things. Fruits come from flowers, and that includes nuts. Any of the things that plants produce that are fruit-like are coming from flowers. They're not always beautiful flowers, but they're coming from flowers. Okay, so here we go. Let's look at this one. So this is from a slide. So this is a longitudinal section. So basically you've taken one of these flowers, you've cut it long ways, so you're looking at it from the side, from this direction. So here's the question. So here we've got our flower. What have we got? We've got, hang on, it stopped moving. So we've got our corolla, we've got our calyx over here, we've got anther and filament, we've got our stigma and style. Is this ovary superior or inferior? Is it superior or inferior? Superior or inferior ovary? Anybody know the answer to that? I see typing. Yes. I see more typing. Yes, correct. That is inferior ovary. So notice the ovary is on the bottom. Everything else is on the top. Very good. Excellent. So here, now we've got a cherry blossom. So again, if we look really close, this one's harder to tell, but it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we got 5 petals. So this is going to be another eudicot, right? Got lots of stamens. But this one, if we take this longitudinal section basically through this end, now what have we got? We've got this thing. This is the hypanthium. So the last one we saw was inferior ovary or an epigynous flower, same thing. This one, however, we've got, what kind of ovary? We've got our receptacle down here. Here's our ovary. Here's our hypanthium. Yes, that's a superior ovary. Excellent, good job. So yes, superior ovary. Now, the flower, is this hypogynous or is it perigynous? So remember, hypo means below, peri means around. So this is going to be a okay, I see you typing. I'm not going to give it away. I see typing. I'm so excited to see typing. Yes. Very good. So yes, this is a perigynous flower. So this has got this hypanthium. And you say, why is it important to know about hypanthium? Because typically this is very, very common in members of the apple family or the rose family. And many of our edible fruits actually have these little cups like this. So this is a cherry. So a cherry actually develops from this little thing. It actually grows out of this hypanthium. If you watch it developing, plums actually have these as well. And if you watch them developing, you'll actually see this little covering, this hypanthium basically falls off as the peach or plum is developing from this. So it's kind of neat stuff. Okay, so let's talk briefly about floral symmetry, and then we may be at a good stopping point. So floral symmetry, you have what's called regular symmetry. So generally when kids draw a flower, you draw something like this first. This is probably what the original flower symmetry was. It's relatively easy to form. It doesn't really matter which direction the pollinator comes in. It's all pretty much the same. So this is radial symmetry, many planes of symmetry. This is a cactus flower, by the way. So cactus can have really beautiful flowers. However, some of the more advanced plants actually started essentially controlling what direction the pollinators were going to come into the flower and being very precise about how the pollinator was going to approach the flower. That is what we sometimes call zygomorphic, or an irregular flower with bilateral symmetry. So notice the right side looks like the left side, but the bottom does not look like the top. This is an orchid. So if we look at this orchid, we can look at the number of petals. We've got 1, 2, 3. So you got 1, 2, 3. These are actually the true petals. This is a specialized petal called the labellum. We've got 1, 2, 3 there. 1, 2, 3 sepals. So that means it's going to be, give you a hint, a monocot. So that one's actually going to be a monocot. The cactus is actually a eudicot, although it's harder to figure out because it's got so many petals. You're probably going to have to use something else to actually